Chapter 751 Super High Quality Equipment, Part 1. 5 days after Baizemin received the message from the 7th Princess of the East Xietain Mayor. In the western part of the base that had now officially become part of the Transcendent faction after the Chinese Renaissance faction changed its leader, homeless people could often be seen wandering around. 3 days ago, the streets were filthy and there were even human feces casually lying around the corners. People sat in the alleys or outside makeshift wooden huts that could not even protect their residents from the night cold properly. Although Baizemin knew that a place so large and with a population of such magnitude would naturally have its low areas since the current rules were not as firm compared to the past, he did not expect to encounter this kind of situation in the base that Xietain had raised from the ground. Therefore, after arriving at that area of the base and seeing the situation, he immediately questioned Xietan's father about it. It was then that Baizemin learned that it was not that Xietain did not want that part of the base to improve, but that he also had his own difficulties. There were some gangs in the area, gangs led by soul evolvers whose levels could not be ignored and with skills that could cause certain headaches if they were assaulted. It was precisely because of this that Xietain came to an agreement with those soul evolvers, and as long as they did not step out of line, he would turn a blind eye to certain issues. Xietain needed time to establish the society, so naturally he had no choice, but he had planned to clean everyone out once things improved. Baizemin naturally did not have the same patience as Xietain, and the way the two of them led or saw things, as well as the way they resolved them, were different. Therefore, he personally charged deep into the western part of the base, and in one night of roaring and explosions, he dyed those lands with the blood of over 7,000 armed militants, and among whom surprisingly there were over 500 soul evolvers, with 10 of them above level 40. Although some innocent people were unfortunately affected and lost their lives, Baizemin would definitely not let a malignant tumor exist within his establishment. Even if he had to take some losses, he was willing as long as he could completely extirpate it from the root. Selfish? Disheartened? Maybe, but being a soft-hearted leader would only lead to everyone suffering more in the long-term future. The clearest proof of this lay in the fact that in order to avoid the deaths of innocents, Xietain did not realize that he was inadvertently affecting the daily lives of countless others. After 2 days of hard work by a team of over 2,000 survivors in charge of doing all kinds of jobs in exchange for food and some food vouchers as pay, the place was completely cleaned up to the point that after one night all bad smells were blown away by the wind. A large part of that area of the base was taken over to start building factories. There were steel and other metal machines that could be used. There was even specialized machinery for making clothing and charcoal that was being installed there. At the same time, in the most secluded area of all, with the nearest factory under construction about 1 kilometer to the south, a simple-looking workshop had been quietly erected. Except for a very limited handful of people, no one was allowed to approach it, as shown by the warning signs posted everywhere. If one approached the door of the workshop or the walls made from the union of several bones of a big-sized mutant beast, one would be able to hear the sound of metal hitting metal coming from inside. Inside the workshop, Baizemin's movements were much more graceful and less brutish compared to his past self. His right arm moved up and down with constant swings, causing the clanging of the rank 3 hammer in his right hand to be strangely pleasant to listen to each time it met with the chest plate almost completely finished. The blue flame danced lazily in the forge furnace, dimly illuminating the surroundings with a sort of ominous but beautiful light. From the small flame occasionally spread a thin, small flame that resembled a small tongue, receiving as an occasional reward some soul stones that it was quick to devour. Although it had not yet evolved, the current endless blue lotus flame was undoubtedly several times more powerful compared to when Baizemin signed a soul contract with it. This was all thanks to the good daily nourishment it received, of course. Standing a few meters away, Mengqi silently watched the movements of the hammer in her brother's hands with a somewhat stunned expression. She was the only person currently present, and thus the only one who could enjoy the beautiful sight. Even though it was just swinging a hammer, there was a certain charm that was hard to describe, and the more one looked the more enchanting one found it. In fact, Mengqi had hardly realized that she had been standing there for the past 3 hours. Approximately 20 to 30 minutes later, Baizemin finally stopped, and with a sigh of exhaustion that also contained satisfaction, he set the forging hammer down on the work table as he looked at the chest plate he had just completed. No, the chest plate was not really finished yet. One last step was missing, a very important one, and also the main reason why Baizemin finally decided to forge a chest plate using materials with metallic properties instead of the typical leather armor, something that would obstruct his overall movement speed. He turned to look at Mengqi, and for the first time since her arrival he showed her a smile. Mengqi, I'm sorry for ignoring you earlier. It's just that I was too focused since I haven't worked with metal chest plates very often. Mengqi shook her head and advanced towards the work table as she said with a smile, "There's no need to apologize for anything, big brother. I didn't even notice the passage of time as I watched you work, so it wasn't wasted time at all. When one did not notice the passing of time, it was because that time was being well spent." Of course, Bai Zemin didn't really believe Mengqi's words and thought that she was being kind to him as she had always been. This was because he was unaware of how elegant his movements were in the eyes of girls thanks to the passive effect of immovable heart and his blacksmithing skill now evolved to the second order. As for the reason why blacksmithing evolved to the second order, this was because Bai Zemin had been locked in his newly erected workshop since the first moment it was possible for him to set up the forging tools inside. "I'll have to trouble you to help me like before." Bai Zemin nodded with a smile as he stepped back and made room for her to take his previous place. Don't worry and leave it to me." Mengqi nodded with a serious expression, and from the small leather bag tied to her waist, she took out a chisel that her brother had built for her previously. "Big brother, this will take me a few hours, so you can go do other things if you want." However, Bai Zemin shook his head and said slowly, "I'll be around. I need to check some of my recently acquired records that I didn't pay deserved attention to." "Okay then." Mengqi nodded and quickly got to work. Lfull.com. Under Bai Zemin's now unsurprised eyes, she stabbed the chisel into a first-order soul stone, and after a few seconds the soul stone turned into a pile of luminous dust that disappeared before it hit the ground. She took the chisel, which now glowed with a faint multicolored light, and slowly began to draw strange patterns on the chest plate. Her movements were very slow and her expression extremely serious, as the process of inscribing runes was far from simple and a single mistake would waste all the work previously done. Bai Zemin shook his head after a few moments and stepped back silently. He really couldn't understand rune engravers. They were a mystery, as they were existences capable of damaging soul stones that even for someone as powerful as Bai Zemin were indestructible. Arriving at the wooden table located in a corner of the workshop, he carefully observed the objects he had been working on for the past 3 days with practically zero rest. These pieces of equipment were very different from the ones Bai Zemin had forged before, and this was because apart from the normal smithing and magic smithing process, these pieces of equipment were surrounded by strange, mysterious-looking engravings that gave each piece a more ancient and at the same time more profound appearance. Precisely, these pieces of equipment had received the care of Mengqi's beautiful hands. All of them were covered by a series of mysterious and complex runes that perhaps no one in the whole of today's earth would be able to understand, but that when joined together added one and sometimes even two special effects more than usual to each piece of equipment. Chapter 752, Super High Quality Equipment, Part 2. Bloody Prowler's Pants. Underside Armor. Rank, 2. Defense, 4200. Durability, 3000/3000. Special Options. 1. Increases defense by 5%. 2. Chances of being noticed by an enemy, treasure, skill, or technological device decrease by 20% when using stealth-type skills. 3. Absorbs enemy blood to repair itself. 4. Its weight is halved when the wearer possesses more than 500 natural points of agility. Description: a piece of armor forged by a blacksmith that slowly begins to advance between ranks, gradually graduating from its novice status using 2 rank, 2 metals as a core and a soul stone as a booster. Low-level runes have been engraved on it. Bai Zemin slowly removed his hand from the surface of the deep red piece of armor, and a glint of satisfaction shone in his eyes. These pants were forged after more than 6 hours of hard work, during which several scales of a level 52 mutant bloody snake were mixed in, giving the equipment an appearance similar to the armored pants used by dragon slayers in legends. Thanks to Mengqi's runes, the improvement of this piece of equipment compared to his previous one was simply colossal. Bai Zemin now looked at the 2 bright red gauntlets that resembled dragon claws and with a faint smile touched one of them. The records immediately flashed in his retina. Thunder red steel grips. Double gauntlet. Rank, 2. Defense, 1200. Physical attack power, 2400. Magical attack power, 2300. Durability, 2400/2400. Special Options. 1. Strength 30. 2. Increases attack speed by 5%. 3. Increases resistance to lightning by 10%. 4. In the hands of the wearer, the weight of an object is reduced by 20% without affecting its actual nature at all. Description: a pair of gauntlets forged using fragments of a rank 2 metal and scales of a mutant electric eel. Thanks to the forging tools used and the runes drawn, the overall power of this piece of dual equipment can be considered among the highest levels of rank 2. Because it was a paired functioning piece of equipment, if one of them was destroyed, the overall power of the remaining one would plummet, probably even below 50% of what it was before. However, together, these gauntlets were undoubtedly wonderful. With these gauntlets, not only was Xietain gaining some extra strength, but he had also gained natural resistance towards an element, which was incredibly rare considering that Xietain previously only managed to acquire fire resistance thanks to the endless blue lotus flame, a natural treasure that at its peak could even strike down gods and demons. The increase in attack speed might be small, but that small 5% in conjunction with the fourth characteristic had become something that Xietain truly appreciated. Now he would be able to wield his greatsword with much greater ease than before, and his attacks would be at least 30% to 40% more terrifying than they already were. Xietan's eyes locked onto the next piece of equipment and his eyes flashed brightly. This piece was actually a large deep red cape but with a large blue lotus drawn on the back, but oddly enough it flickered as if it was alive. At the same time, this cape was actually the piece of equipment that had left Xietain most satisfied in certain aspects. Great Cloak of Infernal Fire. Special equipment. Rank? Defense, 1500. Current magical attack power, 17,000. Durability, 1800/1800. Special options. 1. It has the ability to store fire-type energy inside it to be released by the user at will when she deems it convenient or necessary. 2. Water-ice type attacks are 20% less effective when directed at the back. 3. Allows the user to confuse heat detection systems or skills. 4. As long as it possesses fire-type energy within it, the durability of the Great Cloak of Infernal Fire will not drop. Description: a special piece of equipment born partly as a miracle under the combination of 10 mutant beast hides with fire-type energy stored in them. The rune encryptor managed to understand the blacksmith's feelings and will to perfection, thus being able to finish the job he entrusted to her. Even though he had confirmed the records of this cape a day ago, Xietain still got excited every time he saw them. How could he not get excited after seeing so many awesomeness together? This cape was undoubtedly the second piece of equipment that Xietain was most satisfied with, second only to his main weapon. Thanks to Meng Qi's invaluable help, things that would have been impossible in the past were now open to him. With the power of the endless blue lotus flame waiting to be released all at once, Xietain could only imagine the expressions of shock and disbelief from the pitiful existences that would force him to use it. Xietan's eyes finally focused on the second-to-last piece of equipment on the table. They were a pair of shoulder pads, large heavy shoulder pads of the same color as the chest plate Meng Qi was currently working on, and the pants, deep red. The shoulder pads looked quite ominous. Even Xietain didn't aim for them to look like that, and it just happened during the forging process. With 3 huge dagger-like spines that practically reached his face but fortunately were angled outwards, Xietain could only apologize in his heart for those who in the middle of a close combat would receive a shoulder blow from him. Soul Shoulders of Bloodshed, heavy shoulder pads. Rank, 2. Defense, 3000. Physical attack power, 2000. Durability, 3500/3500. Special options. 1. Inflicts tearing wounds and produces inevitable bleeding for enemies whose health stat is below the wearer's. 2. Its weight is halved when the wielder possesses more than 500 natural agility points. 3. Can release the blades from the surface to perform a surprise ranged attack in times of need. 4. Absorbs enemy blood to self-repair. Description: a set of heavy shoulder pads forged by a blacksmith with an interesting but dangerous imagination. 3 lower runes were formed after the union of over 10,000 engravings made by a novice encryptor. Honestly, Xietain was really satisfied with these shoulder pads. Although the shoulder pads could be considered a kind of bonus since it naturally could not compare in importance with chest plate and pants, the shoulder pads that he and Meng Qi had created together were of such high quality that they could even help the wearer in the midst of combat. Finally, Xietan's eyes fell upon the last piece of equipment, another set that together formed one. They were a pair of leg protectors, and at the same time they were not. This was because their appearance was especially dominant, and not because Xietain wanted them to be, but because of their natural characteristics and the materials used during the process of normal smithing and magic smithing made them so. Leg plates of Unholy Vengeance. Special item. Rank, 2. Defense, 4000. Physical attack power, 4200. Durability, 7000/7000. lfull.com. Special options. 1. Hitting with the knee gives the user a 100% chance to penetrate any defensive armor below rank 2, 50% for rank 2 defensive armor, and 2% for rank 3 defensive armor. 2. When hitting with the knee, the chance of inflicting a critical hit is increased by 10%. 3. After receiving a wound and counterattacking with the knee, the attack power is doubled. 4. Decreases its weight by 20% without obstructing the user's natural movements. Description: leg protectors? Who said that leg protectors only served as an extra means of defense? A piece of equipment born under the marvelous imagination of a blacksmith and a rune encryptor. If you're a man and ever get hit by these things, at least try to make sure you protect your crotch, or there'll be one less difference between you and a woman. Xietain forced a smile as he silently shook his head. The description of the object was really interesting, to say the least. However, the description wasn't wrong at all. The leg protectors went from the calf and covered even the knees. Normally, covering the knees with leg guards was unwise, as they would become hindrances to the movement of the whole body in general, but with the fourth option present, Xietain would not have that problem. As for the reason why Xietain had created such troublesome leg protectors, Xietain stroked the two red sides protruding from the knee area, and a vicious glint shone in his eyes for a moment before disappearing. He had used two of the sides he obtained from the corpses of the Third Order Weaver ants he killed inside the hall where the Sky Destroyer was located. Only Xietain himself and Shengguan Bingshui knew how terrifying and deadly those sides were, but their enemies surely wouldn't want to find out. He finally sighed and turned to look at his younger sister. Mengqi was working really hard and with extreme concentration in her eyes, solely focused on the deep red chest plate before her. Xietain was really very grateful to her. Thanks to Mengqi and her ability, Xietan's overall power had risen again, even though he was still stuck at level 50. He did not doubt that in the future, and when she was able to comprehend and draw better runes, the future pieces of equipment he forged would be so terrifying that he could not even imagine it. Chapter 753, Problems with the Egg. Although Mengqi could also engrave runes on other things such as bracelets, rings, earrings, necklaces, and boots, Xietain did not forge any such items. This was because his current bracelets, rings, earrings, and boots were of much use to him. Even if Xietain ignored stat points, what he really cared about were the skills and effects attached to his current accessories and boots. Taking his boots as an example, the fact that he could activate a skill that increased his agility stat by an extra 100 points was simply too tempting and useful for Xietain to be willing to give up on them so easily. 100 points of extra agility was no small thing at this stage. 100 points was more than enough to decide winner/loser and who lived or who died in a fight. This was especially true if the boot skill was used wisely at a crucial moment in the combat. At least until Mengqi could master more about the runes and expand her knowledge and ability about them, Xietain preferred to keep his current treasures rather than replace them with accessories he had forged himself. After all, the soul record treasures had their own unique characteristics that a normal piece of equipment could never possess, attached skills, for example. After the pieces of equipment, Xietain rested some of his body weight against the wooden table before finally focusing on his records. Congratulations, you have fulfilled all the requirements to advance to the next stage in your subclass. The intelligent existences under your rule are now over 300,000, and they all see you as a worthy and respectable leader to follow. Keep it up. Your subclass lord has evolved to Marquis. Continue recruiting more subordinates to advance to the next stage. A faint smile slowly appeared at the corner of Xietan's lips, now slightly raised upwards. These records had flashed in his retina exactly 2 days after Wuqian had announced to all the top brass of the base that Xietain was taking full leadership and control from that moment onwards. With the support of several workers and soul evolvers who admired, respected, and appreciated the courageous behavior of the young man who had gone days without sleep and refused to leave the front lines even for a single moment during the Great War against the Goblin Army, Xietan's feet spread like wildfire through every corner of the base, and soon it was also announced that the previous leader had given up his seat in order to allow this new star to lead them to a better future. At first, there were some problems, as a certain group of people dissatisfied with the inevitable changes that would occur once the leadership changed from the previous one tried to spread evil rumors, and even a mysterious group of survivors appeared claiming that Xietain had been doing evil deeds in the shadows. Fortunately, no one believed the words of those survivors who were clearly in disarray. Their words were not only senseless, but even a fool would be able to realize that the reason they were doing what they were doing was solely and exclusively due to benefits received with threats mixed in. As for the group of troublemakers, they all disappeared without a trace. However, everyone knew in their hearts that they had been purged during the night, but no one dared to point it out. Everyone had understood that this new leader could be an angel but also a demon when it was necessary to change masks to adapt better to the situation, and honestly, no one wanted to see the demon's mask. Xietain scoffed in his heart before finally focusing on the records his new subclass possessed. Marquis, increases your overall power by 9%, and in situations of mortal danger your natural stats are multiplied for 5 seconds. The number of loyal followers you can appoint is now increased to 10, and those who become your loyal follower will never be able to betray you. In addition, each of your loyal followers will have access to 20% of your total strength in life and death situations and will have access to 5% of your strength without affecting you when they go into combat mode. Baizemen's new subclass was, by far, much more powerful compared to his previous one. Marquis not only increased his overall power by twice as much compared to Lord, but also granted Baizemen a huge lifeline by multiplying his natural stats, even if it was only 5 seconds. Those 5 seconds were more than enough for him to dodge the decapitating guillotine or even end his enemy's life thanks to the massive stat buff. Although the subclass Marquis did not grant overall power as a percentage based on the number of intelligent beings under his leadership, Baizemen thought it was natural for such a thing to happen considering the colossal step-up that was required for Lord to evolve into Marquis. He was more than satisfied with the new ability to multiply his natural stats for a short period of time, and had only lost a pitiful 1.7%, which was actually immediately outweighed by the 9% increase in his overall strength granted by this new subclass. Baizemen looked at his pieces of equipment, and after confirming the potential of his new subclass, he came to the conclusion that the current him would not necessarily lose in battle against Shangguan Bingshui even with the difference in stats and without him using his more destructive attacks. In fact, he was over 70% confident that he would be the victor in the hypothetical and clearly impossible event of such a thing happening. I need to forge new equipment for Bingshui. I'll take a few days off first and focus on her as we move south. Baizemen muttered under his breath as he rubbed his chin. Shangguan Bingshui was indisputably Baizemen's right-hand person on the battlefield. She was the only one who truly possessed the ability to take on not one but several third-order existences at the same time. Moreover, in contrast to the current Baizemen, Shangguan Bingshui was becoming stronger for every enemy defeated and soul power orb absorbed. Because she was using the poor quality pieces of equipment they obtained in Oblong World during the war against the Azura race, Shangguan Bingshui's power did not shine as brightly as it could shine if she had better equipment. That was precisely why Baizemen was determined to forge for her, as she was definitely worth it. He fully trusted that she would never betray him, and thus, the stronger Shangguan Bingshui was the better it would be for everyone in the Transcendent faction, not only in terms of safety but also in terms of expansion speed. Baizemen walked silently to the side of the forge furnace. His steps were light, trying to make as little noise as possible so as not to disturb Mengqi and cause all the work she had done so far on the chest plate to go to waste. There, in a corner, the metal-colored egg rested quietly. Baizemen embraced it and took it to a corner before he began to observe it carefully. It was not difficult for him, who had been next to the egg practically every moment since the previous Ant Queen handed it to him, to notice that most if not all of the mana and records surrounding the egg's outer layer had been completely absorbed. Even those strange pulsating veins had practically stopped moving and now were mostly just there, still as if they had fallen asleep. What's going on? Baizemen frowned tightly and a glint of worry shone in his eyes. He had no idea how to be a father, he hadn't even changed a single diaper in his entire life, forget about knowing how to hatch an ant's egg, a mutant ant and the queen at that. Could it be that something went wrong? Baizemen's heart squeezed tightly and a wave of panic began to overtake him. Putting aside the fact that Kong Jun would definitely not spare Baizemen ever, even if he could not hurt him directly because he was under the effect of the loyal follower subclass, Kong Jun would definitely find ways to give Baizemen a lot of headaches, and to fight against that monster perhaps only the union of him and Shangguan Bingshui could lead them to a secure victory. But fighting him would also cause the loyal follower effect to fade away, which would mean total freedom for the third-order apocalyptic ant. But what mattered most to Baizemen was not the consequences or Kong Jun's reaction. What really mattered to him was that for the past few days he had been very attached to this egg and had actually become a little fond of the life that was supposed to hatch soon. No matter how one put it, the little creature sleeping in there was, at the end of the day, the adopted daughter he had accepted. All this not to mention the fact that Baizemen had made a promise to Queen Shirlin that he would guard with his life this little future queen yet to be born. Seeing that Mengqi was still working and would probably take another hour or two before finishing, Baizemen softly walked to the door and soundlessly opened it before stepping out and then closing it. He needed to look for Lilith and ask her if she knew anything about it. Although Baizemen didn't have high hopes, it wasn't as if he could just stand still and do nothing. Chapter 754, Daughter's Birth and Accidental Situation, Part 1. Baizemen was like a mother duck taking care of its little duckling, and as he ran quickly towards the base he watched the surroundings cautiously while holding the metallic gray egg close to his chest as if he feared that some kind of predatory eagle or egg-eating snake would appear and snatch it away from him. Fortunately his movement speed was extremely fierce, so the survivors only felt a powerful gust of wind pushing them sideways without even seeing a flash, or else Xietain would definitely have been looked at with weird eyes and many rumors would have spread in a matter of hours. Xietain was so anxious about all this that he even forgot that he could use invisibility to avoid some possible minor inconveniences. All Xietain cared about right now was getting to his home, where Lilith had practically stayed to live in her human form and shared the days with his mother. When he reached the high walls of the privileged area, he didn't care at all about the security check, and with a powerful stomp he jumped over 300 meters, soaring over the tall trunks that were once part of brilliant and huge mutant trees. When his feet touched the ground, he immediately charged towards home, but just as he had gone a little over 2 kilometers, he stopped when it seemed to him that someone was calling out to him. Xietain looked back and was surprised to see Shangguan Bingshui rushing swiftly towards him. He couldn't help but feel that today really was a bad day, since he assumed that she came with bad news. Therefore, when Shangguan Bingshui finally stopped in front of him, Xietain finally asked in a serious voice, "Bingshui, what happened?" "You ask me what happened?" Shangguan Bingshui looked at him suspiciously before asking in a puzzled voice. "The correct question would be what happened to you?" Xietain looked at her in confusion, to which she responded rolling her eyes. "I was on the shopping street when a gust of wind sent over 5 food stalls flying. Curious, I went to see who was the soul evolver that was causing minor trouble, but what a surprise I got when I climbed up one of the nearby buildings and found your figure zigzagging through the alleys as if you were a thief who had just escaped from his victim's house." This. Xietain really didn't know what to say in this moment and couldn't help but feel a little awkward. He had forgotten that running at high speeds in tight places would naturally cause the gusts of wind produced by the explosive speed to compress more and push sideways with greater force before bouncing back and pushing in the opposite direction again with only a little less pressure. Therefore, Xietain had overlooked that by doing what he was doing, some people's lives would naturally be slightly affected, at least for a few seconds or minutes. Remembering the matter at hand, Xietain quickly shook his head and hurriedly said, "Bingshui, you help me compensate those people affected because of me. Give them some red or yellow food coupons depending on the damage suffered. I have to go." Xietain had barely turned around, but even before he could explode with great speed again, Shangguan Bingshui's voice stopped him. "Wait. Lfull.com, what is it now?" Xietain looked at her with wide eyes and couldn't stop his voice from rising a little. Shangguan Bingshui kept her mouth tightly shut, surprised by the reaction of the always calm and composed Xietain. The person in front of her was completely different from the Xietain she knew. However, Shangguan Bingshui was not only a very beautiful woman but also very intelligent and a brilliant observer. "Can you tell me what is troubling you? Maybe I can help you," she said softly. It wasn't hard for her to connect the little dots and realize that something bad must have happened, otherwise there was no way Xietain would break his own rules without even realizing it. Besides, judging from the direction he was heading just now, Shangguan Bingshui estimated that it was something related to his family. Xietain hesitated for a moment, and he really wanted to tell Shangguan Bingshui that they better talk later. After all, he didn't think she could do anything about the situation he was currently in. However, seeing those 2 beautiful blue eyes looking at him with such a gentle expression, and remembering that usually those same eyes were as cold as ice to 99.99% of people, Xietain's heart softened, and in the midst of anxiety he couldn't help but not wanting to waste the goodwill of the woman in front of him. After a few seconds of silence, Xietain sighed and nodded before he began to explain to Shangguan Bingshui what was going on. Although Xietain was talking fast and like a locomotive that would stop at nothing as a product of his anxiety, Shangguan Bingshui listened to every word, and when he stopped, she finally nodded with a serious expression on her face. Since the matter involved the little life inside the egg Xietain had been guarding so cautiously all this time, Shangguan Bingshui managed to understand and comprehend his concern and lack of attention to minor matters. "Therefore, Bingshui, we will talk later. Help me solve these small problems I caused due to my carelessness. I need to go see Lilith to have her help me find a solution." Shangguan Bingshui's expression changed slightly but quickly returned to normal. She didn't give Xietain time to turn around this time, and as she took a step forward, she softly said, "Wait a moment, let me see if I can do anything. Who knows, maybe I can find where the problem lies, and that will save you from having to run several kilometers." This. Xietain hesitated for a moment before gritting his teeth and nodding vigorously, "All right." Shangguan Bingshui not only had better control over the mana than Xietain, so perhaps she would be able to identify where the problem with the gray egg was. But there was also the fact that even if Lilith could identify the problem, she could do nothing about it since the soul record would not allow such a thing. Shangguan Bingshui received the metallic-colored egg with a serious expression on her face, and when she held it in her delicate hands, she could not help but want to treat it with care. This was probably because she knew that this egg, or rather, the life inside it, was very important to Xietain. Xietain felt like an ant being exposed to the sun under a magnifying glass, fidgeting no matter what he did as he stared at Shangguan Bingshui. He, despite being young, had already made up his mind that he would soon have a little daughter to take care of, and therefore, Xietain had imagined many scenes and had even thought of a good name for her. Consequently, he didn't want something bad to happen or else it would be a big blow to him. After a few seconds, Shangguan Bingshui's eyes sparkled and she couldn't help but smile as she raised her head and said with enthusiasm, "I know what's wrong." "Really?" Xietain shouted so loudly that several people who had gone out to walk pets or just to stretch their bodies a bit stopped to see what was going on. He didn't mind any of this and quickly asked with twice her enthusiasm, "Bingshui, what's the problem? Tell me quickly." "Actually, it's not serious. At least for now, that is. It will be a problem in a day or two," Shangguan Bingshui said in a serious voice before slowly explaining, "It seems that the little life in is very greedy, and after eating all the mana that the previous queen left behind, she is still not satisfied and wants more." This. Xietain blinked in astonishment as this was something he did not expect. The mana that the previous queen of the weaver ants had left behind was quite a large amount. Xietain was sure of it because he had been there practically from the beginning. However, the future queen did not seem happy and after eating all that mana she was still looking for more. Xietain was secretly glad that the little life inside the egg hadn't tried to absorb the world's mana. That unrefined mana would probably kill her after all. "Bingshui, give me the egg. I'll give her my mana for her to absorb in that case." "Okay." Shangguan Bingshui knew she couldn't argue here so without another word she returned the egg to him. Xietain immediately went to work, and once he received back the metallic-colored egg, he began to release all the mana in his body through his hands. He had no fixed target, he was simply spending his mana points. However, the life inside the egg reacted immediately and those red veins that had been still immediately seemed to catch their breath as they glowed slightly and at surprisingly high speeds began to absorb all the mana Xietain was releasing. Seeing that the method actually worked, Xietain subconsciously sighed in relief, and as he continued to feed the egg with his mana, he raised his head to give the woman in front of him a smile and eyes brimming with gratitude. Chapter 755 Daughter's Birth and Accidental Situation, Part 2. Shangguan Bingshui watched the situation unfolding in front of her and subconsciously released the air she was holding in her chest in the form of a sigh of relief. Although she believed she had found where the problem was, Shangguan Bingshui wasn't really 100% sure either. While she was an even higher genius than Xietain when it came to comprehending the energy called mana even though her mana was ironically lower than his at the beginning of the apocalypse, Shangguan Bingshui was just like Xietain when it came to hatching mutant ant eggs, she didn't have the slightest clue about it. She just didn't want Xietain to go in search of Lilith for everything. Shangguan Bingshui wanted to show him that they could fix their own problems without relying on an unknown existence that didn't even belong to the same world as them and whose goals were mysterious and unknown. Fortunately, she succeeded. "Bingshui, you really saved me this time." Xietain sighed and suddenly felt his legs felt weak. Shangguan Bingshui took a step forward and easily held him by the arm while looking at him with amused eyes. "I wonder what all existences you killed in that Fourth Order Azure Emperor who could only watch you leave under his nose helplessly would think if they saw you in such a pitiful condition despite not being on any battlefield." Xietain was not embarrassed at all and as he straightened up with her help, he said with a snort, "This is also a battlefield, the battlefield of a father fighting for his child's life." Shangguan Bingshui almost burst out laughing when she heard his words, but after thinking a bit about her past and all the hardships her father went through in order to raise her alone, she felt it was not a matter to laugh about. Xietain, who had actually only said those words to lighten his own still nervous mood a bit, was a bit surprised when he saw Shangguan Bingshui's serious expression. "I guess you're right. Taking care of a small child is also a battlefield in itself." But Xietain was also smart, he was quick to realize what was going through the head of the young woman next to him. After all, Xietain was aware of Shangguan Bingshui's past. In an attempt to change the subject a bit, he looked at the metallic gray egg in his hands and said in astonishment, "Still, I must say that this little dude sure devours mana like crazy. I've already lost over 100 mana points but it's still eating non-stop." Shangguan Bingshui paused to think for a moment before suggesting, "What do you say about going to my place? Go to your house?" Xietain looked at her in confusion. "My house is only 2 streets away from here, while yours is more than 20 kilometers from here." Shangguan Bingshui explained calmly, and while pointing at the surroundings with her eyes, she indicated her purpose. "We can go to my house and there you will be more comfortable to provide mana to the little life inside the egg." I don't think it would be convenient to stay here if the future Ant Queen is born today. Bai Zemin followed Shangguan Bingshue's eyes and finally understood what she meant. In fact, there were some people in the privileged area who were watching curiously and murmuring while looking at the strange glowing egg that clearly belonged to some kind of mutant monster. Bai Zemin even listened as a 6 or 7-year-old boy asked his mother to buy him one of those eggs so that he could raise his own dragon and become a dragon rider in the future. Alright, let's go to your house. Bai Zemin nodded without much thought. Although he didn't mind these people seeing the egg, it would be something completely different when the little life inside it hatched. Bai Zemin did not know what kind of appearance his daughter would have when she hatched from the egg, however, what he did know was that she would probably have various ant-like characteristics. Perhaps antennae, bulging eyes, scythes near the mouth, insect legs, etc. Whatever the ant characteristics were, these survivors living in the privileged area would definitely be scared to death, and within hours the entire base would learn that a person had brought a mutant creature into the establishment. This could cause several problems that while they could be solved with a few days of effort, Bai Zemin preferred to avoid them if they could be avoided. Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshue looked at these people with cold expressions before releasing just a hint of killing intent, causing the faces of those closest to them to turn pale and subconsciously take a couple of steps back before lowering their heads without daring to look anymore. It wasn't that they wanted to intimidate the weak, both he and she weren't bored enough to waste time like this, nor were they immature children after all the hardships they had been through. It was just that this was the only way to show everyone that the two of them were powerful soul evolvers, which would also imply that they had certain privileges that the normal privileged survivors did not. Only then would these people not start spreading false rumors. Lfull.com. After walking for 2 or 3 minutes in silence, Shangguan Bingshue led Bai Zemin to her house, and once he entered she looked around cautiously before locking the door. Bai Zemin had already been to Shangguan Bingshue's house once in the past. It was when he finally started moving again after a week of peace and quiet with his then newly reunited family. It was also when he first learned that she had already broken to the Second Order, and even at such a high level. This house was perhaps a bit larger than the house belonging to Bai Zemin's family, but also considerably more luxurious. It was the house that Wu Keqian and Sun Ling had arranged for her. In fact, if not for Shangguan Bingshue rejecting several oversized houses that had been offered to her, she would be living in a more spacious place. Bingshue, why did you decide to stay in this house instead of a more luxurious one? Bai Zemin asked when she entered the living room. Shangguan Bingshue did not answer right away and instead put some water to heat in the kettle before walking to the opposite seat where Bai Zemin was sitting. She looked him in the face and calmly replied, an overly large house would look too lonely for just one person. As he continued to feed the egg with his mana, Bai Zemin looked into her eyes for a few seconds before sighing, you know, Bingshue, sometimes I can't help but wonder what kind of person you'd be if that piece of trash of a father that life gave you had been a bit more of a man and more responsible. Who knows? But, I'm not complaining. Shangguan Bingshue shook her head, and while looking at him with glittering eyes, she smiled slightly. A certain someone once told me during our first night hunt in a mutant forest that hating those who did us wrong would also be hating ourselves. After all, those people who surely helped most to forge our personalities and made us what we are today. Bai Zemin's mouth opened slightly, remembering that the same night that he and Shangguan Bingshue finally became friends after having been fighting together back to back for a while, he had told her that he didn't hate the girl who hurt him so much in the past, because it was thanks to her that he was what he was today. However, Bai Zemin also managed to grasp something else from Shangguan Bingshue's words. That means you. Shangguan Bingshue pulled a lock of hair behind her right ear with a graceful movement and replied to Bai Zemin's unfinished words, I can't say I don't hate that man. I'm not that good of a person, let alone a saint. However, if he understands what is convenient for him and obediently surrenders after we beat him up, then I will allow him to live. Bai Zemin's eyes flashed with a bit of relief but also with various complicated emotions. He didn't want Shangguan Bingshue to kill her father, because while she might hate him to the bone today, her feelings might change as the years went by. Maybe she would hate the man named Xianyuan Wentian for 100 years, maybe it would be for 500 years. Maybe even for 1,000 years. However, if Bai Zemin achieved his goal, or perhaps Shangguan Bingshue herself achieved it on her own, then they would live eternally, eternal beings who will not be corrupted or corroded by time. Eternity was too lengthy, too much time. In an eternity, the feelings of people could change over the years, and Bai Zemin did not want a person as important to him as was the woman sitting on the couch 5 feet away to live an eternity of bitterness due to actions of her younger self. Now, however, a new problem had been born. Bingshue, you know it won't be easy to force Xianyuan Wentian into surrender, don't you? Bai Zemin remarked with a serious expression. Seeing her nod calmly, he nodded back and continued, Xianyuan Wentian is a man who was in the highest position in all of China for too long, and even in the entire world of the past there was no one who dared to disrespect him considering his position and power. In this new world, he is very likely to be a powerful soul evolver even if he cannot manage to compare to the two of us, not to mention the fact that he must possess a great deal of military might and even a few million survivors under his control. Actually, Baizemin also suspected that the person who had managed to acquire a nuclear facility was Xianyuan Wentian himself. Although it was only a suspicion and he could not confirm it for sure, Baizemin had always had good instincts for danger, so he was quite confident in this suspicion of him. But he did not tell Shangguan Bingshui as it would not only be meaningless but would add more weight to her conscience. She had just made such an important decision that she needed time to relax a bit. Baizemin did not want to be a cause of pressure for her. Baizemin, even the most talented general of all, can only show his talent if he possesses an army to lead, Shangguan Bingshui pointed out. Her eyes flashed with a glint of coldness that even chilled Baizemin's blood as she said in a low voice, and the strongest swordsmen need their hands to wield their swords or else they will be nothing but useless. I said I'll let him live. But I never said I will let him go easily. Shangguan Bingshui stood up and walked to the kettle which announced that the water was boiling with a loud whistling sound. As he looked at her elegant and slender back, her calm but full of coldness voice sounded inside the silent room. That man, Xianyuan Wentian, always loved swordsmanship, and as my mother told me he trained with the sword from a very young age. That's why I also practiced with the sword, because I wanted to beat him in every aspect of life. I am aware that in the past I was being obsessed and that such a thing would never happen, but things are different now. Baizemin was silent, and after Shangguan Bingshui returned with 2 cups of tea brimming with the scent of lemon, he said in a calm and composed voice, So, you want to cut off his arms so that he can never touch a sword again in his entire life? Shangguan Bingshui put down one of the cups in front of him before returning to her seat. She took a sip before nodding slightly. Yeah. I want him to never be able to touch a sword ever again in his life. He loves swordplay as much as he loves his life. Then I'll take away what he loves most. And if he can't live with it, then it's up to him whether he chooses to live or not. Forget about taking away the arms of a person who loved the swords and swordsmanship as much as he loved his own life. Cutting off the arms of a soul evolver in this world where dangers lurked in every corner was not much different from cutting off the wings of a bird. However, Baizemin was fine with the decision she had made. At least, if Xianyuan Wentian died it would not be under her daughter's sword. Baizemin and Shangguan Bingshui discussed various matters and began to go over important details that needed to receive some adjustments. There were only 2 days left before the expedition to the south would officially begin, and in fact, while the two of them were meeting here, there were 400 soul evolvers who were preparing to march south in less than 48 hours. Chapter 756, Daughter's Birth and Accidental Situation, Part 3. After an hour, Baizemin's face had become as pale as a sheet and his vision blurred, so he had no choice but to lean back and let his back rest on the back of the couch. That little one is still swallowing your mana? Shangguan Bingshui asked in a low voice but with impossible to conceal astonishment as her blue eyes locked onto the metallic gray egg in Baizemin's embrace. It looks like we underestimated her appetite. Baizemin replied in an exhausted voice. He had been giving his mana to the little life inside the egg, but Baizemin hadn't expected something like what he was experiencing right now. His mana reserves were high, monstrously high for a first-order existence. However, even with his 800 total mana points, it seemed like it wasn't enough. It feels like a black hole wants to swallow me whole. Baizemin forced a smile and gently shook his head as he said wearily, At this rate, I will be forced to use overlap regeneration. If possible, Baizemin did not want to use overlap regeneration in this situation. That second activation of his regeneration skill was practically his main lifeline, and while everything was currently calm, no one really knew what would happen within the next instant. This was not the Earth of the past. Everyone knew that from one second to the next a terrifying enemy could appear at the gates of the base and start a merciless massacre. Therefore, all the most powerful and 1-hour cooldown skills of each soul evolver were reserved for moments of real crisis, and no one used them casually. Shangguan Bingshui paused in thought for a moment to think of a solution. Her eyes suddenly lit up and she immediately told Baizemin her idea. How about giving me the egg so that I can supply it with mana while you rest and allow your mana to slowly recover? That way, if my mana reserves turn out to be insufficient, you'll already be quite recharged. Maybe you don't need to use overlap regeneration then. Baizemin's eyes lit up in the same manner as Shangguan Bingshui's and he quickly nodded. That's a good idea. Your mana should be higher than mine, so you should be able to resist longer than me. You should be able to recover at least a few hundred mana points in the hypothetical case that you run out and this little glutton keeps asking for more. Without further delay, Bai Zemin passed the metallic gray egg to Shangguan Bingshui, putting it carefully in her hands. Neither of them had any kind of reaction when their hands touched, and when Bai Zemin cut off the mana supply, Shangguan Bingshui immediately began to expend hers, using her mana as food this time and thus allowing him to recover a little. Time passed quickly. Occasionally the two would chat about different things, but mostly they were silent, with the accompanying sound being the wind blowing against the closed windows and the water of the pool located a couple of meters outside the living room. When two people were alone inside a room and remained in silence for a long time, it was normal for both of them to start feeling a bit anxious and even uncomfortable with the silence. However, this was not the case for Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui. To begin with, they were both people who valued words in their own ways, and when there was not something important to say or something interesting to tell, they preferred to be silent. In addition, the two were very comfortable sitting close to each other in silence, which was very rare between two individuals, especially since they were of opposite sexes. In the eyes of many, the fact that two people did not speak and remained silent was a sign of a lack of trust. However, Bai Zemin did not see it that way. To Bai Zemin, the fact that he and Shangguan Bingshui could enjoy silence in each other's presence meant that the trust between the two had reached such a high level that words were not necessary to understand each other. If a person could not be comfortable with themselves in solitude, then that person would never be truly comfortable in the presence of others. If two people could be comfortable in silence together, then there was no doubt that the trust between those two people was as high as the heavens themselves. After several minutes of silence, Shangguan Bingshui opened her mouth and calmly said, 2 days ago, while you were still in your workshop, I had a conversation with Chen He. Oh? Bai Zemin had been looking towards the window, but when he heard Shangguan Bingshui's words his interest immediately piqued, so he turned to look at her and asked, Are you talking about what I think you're talking about? I probably am. Shangguan Bingshui nodded. Seeing that Bai Zemin wasn't asking any more questions, she asked, Aren't you curious to know what happened? I am curious, of course. Bai Zemin replied in a voice that suggested obviousness. Even during the time when they were all normal students, Bai Zemin had heard many things about Shangguan Bingshui and Chen He. After all, the two of them were simply too popular. Putting aside their identities and status within the university, Shangguan Bingshui was the #1 beauty and Chen He was the most handsome guy on campus. They were often seen together, so naturally there were many rumors that the two were a couple. Even Bai Zemin himself had seen them together a couple of times. Although many things had changed, Bai Zemin was still curious about Shangguan Bingshui and Chen He's future in terms of romance. After all, regardless of all the changes of fate, Bai Zemin was only a young man in his 20s, he was also a bit gossipy about certain matters. However, it's just that despite my curiosity, I don't think it's right to ask questions about a subject that, if we're honest, doesn't really involve me. He explained calmly as he looked into her eyes. Shangguan Bingshui closed her eyes slowly, remaining silent for a few seconds before opening them again. She sighed and couldn't help but speak the words of her heart, you know. Despite being born into an ordinary family and living your whole life in the middle class, your education and tact are much higher than most upper-class people who received tutelage from top professionals in various fields. Bai Zemin chuckled, knowing that Shangguan Bingshui's words were not meant to offend him but quite the opposite. The main education is provided at home, then it is up to the individual to accept what he or she has learned or not and modify it to form his or her own personality. My parents would have beaten me up if I had strayed from the path they showed me, so I learned from my mother's flying slippers and my father's kicks in the butt. Shangguan Bingshui did not expect such words at all, which was why her eyes widened for a moment before the inevitable finally happened. Ha 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 ha. Her laughter was clear and sweet, not loud but strong enough for those who heard it to know that she was laughing from the heart and not pretending. Ha ha ha. She continued to laugh for almost a full minute before finally starting to calm down a bit. Looking at Bai Zemin on the verge of tears from laughing so hard, Shangguan Bingshui said with a big smile that was as bright and beautiful as the summer sun, If your subordinates knew that the all-powerful god of war they worship so much actually got caught by flying slippers and kicked in the butt, they would probably drop their jaw until they hit the ground. Meh, this daddy is lord of the house now and I even sit at the head of the table during dinner. If that old man tries to kick my butt, I'll personally make him remember the spanking grandpa used to give him. Bai Zemin said with an air of smugness. Shangguan Bingshui's eyes sparkled and the smile on her face grew more and more. She had just used some words that a polite and demure lady would never say, but far from pointing it out, Bai Zemin took it as if it was something normal. Shangguan Bingshui was used to being treated like a goddess, a flawless and perfect fairy. But little did the others know that she simply wanted to be treated as a normal person, not as something she was not. And what about the flying slippers? Those attacks can't be dodged. Oh? For what reason? Alfull.com. It's because the mothers will get angrier if you do. Ha 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 ha. Whatever Qin He and Shangguan Bingshui had talked about, it was temporarily a secret to Bai Zemin. He didn't ask and Shangguan Bingshui didn't say anything either, which meant that there were probably some things that were not so easy to say. Be that as it may, the two of them were too weak to avoid being controlled by the threads of fate. If something was meant to happen then it would happen, if something was meant to come to light then someday it would see the light. About 2 hours later, Shangguan Bingshui's face had finally turned 80% pale, which was a sign that it wouldn't be long before all her mana would drop to really critical low levels. What kind of little monster is growing in there? She muttered in total shock. Bai Zemin was as shocked as she was. That little one has absorbed far more than 2,000 mana points from just the two of us, but it also ate all the mana and records that the former Ant Queen left behind. Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui looked at each other and both noticed the wariness in each other's eyes. Although Bai Zemin wanted to take care of the life inside the egg as his daughter, it was unknown if that little newborn ant would identify him as her father. Considering the amounts of mana and records that the life inside the egg had absorbed so far, if at birth she became an enemy it could be no small problem. Unfortunately, Shangguan Bingshui's mana turned out to be insufficient as well, so Bai Zemin had to relieve her 10 minutes later. How much mana did you manage to recover? 426 points. Let's hope it's enough. However, it wasn't enough. Approximately 30 minutes later, Bai Zemin's face had turned deathly pale and his lips had lost all color. How much mana have you recovered? I think you'll have to use overlap regeneration. Bai Zemin sighed upon hearing Shangguan Bingshui's words but finally nodded. He somehow was expecting such a thing to happen, now he could only pray that a single activation would be enough. Under Shangguan Bingshui's shining eyes, Bai Zemin's body was soon surrounded by that wonderful golden radiance and his entire being seemed to undergo a transcendental change. However, the duration was too short so she did not have time to appreciate this state for too long before it disappeared completely. That skill of yours, overlap regeneration, it really is a mystery. Bai Zemin, it really makes you look like an omnipotent being every time you use it. She said with a sigh that contained emotions difficult to decipher. Shangguan Bingshui didn't know that overlap regeneration was actually the second activation of a skill and Bai Zemin didn't say it. Not because he didn't trust her but because there was simply no need to since nothing would really change. Bai Zemin said nothing and continued to give his now replenished mana to the gluttonous egg in his hands. Even though Meng Qi was probably done with the chest plate, he could only focus on what he had on his hands at the moment for now. Approximately 40 minutes later and just as the two people inside the room were beginning to feel their bodies about to break out in sweat due to nerves, a change finally occurred. The metallic gray egg suddenly released a faint glow of 4 colors. There was red, there was silver, there was black, and there was gold. Bingshui Bai Zemin stood up in fright, and as he looked at Shangguan Bingshui with wide eyes, he said in shock, it's hatching. Shangguan Bingshui was as nervous as he was so she also stammered as she pointed to the couch and said quickly, by now. Put the egg over there better. Oh okay. Bai Zemin hurriedly turned around and delicately set the egg down on the couch before backing away, bumping into the small table and breaking it into thousands of tiny pieces of glass. The two were like two anxious children so they couldn't worry about anything but the glowing egg that under their astonished eyes grew to twice its previous size in a matter of seconds. The glow quickly grew, reaching a point that both Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui had no choice but to half close their eyes and partially cover their eyesight using a hand. The sky had darkened considerably at this point, and the survivors who happened to be walking near Shangguan Bingshui's house stopped in amazement as a bright light of various colors broke beyond the windows. They all looked at each other in shock, before silently retreating from that area for fear of being caught up in some kind of mysterious explosion. Inside the house, Shangguan Bingshui and Bai Zemin finally began to see more clearly once the multicolored light began to dim and recede. When the two were finally able to see everything normally again, what immediately attracted the attention of both of them was that lying on the couch was a silhouette curled up in a ball like a small kitten. However, the silhouette was still surrounded by that multicolored light so it was not possible to see its appearance clearly. A few seconds passed but the small figure did not move and both Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui were too nervous to make any move. Not only were they nervous because of happiness but they were also uneasy as they did not know whether the future queen of the ants would greet them with a kind smile or with cruel eyes. The multicolored light was disappearing, but before it disappeared completely, the small figure that was curled into a ball suddenly moved. The figure that was at most 1 meter tall sat down with great difficulty on the couch, and even though its face was not visible, both Shangguan Bingshui and Bai Zemin could feel that it was watching them intently. I can finally see your faces. Father, mother. The voice clearly belonging to a little girl coming from the figure was sweet and childish but very polite, and above all, excited as if she had been waiting for this moment for centuries long. Shangguan Bingshui and Bai Zemin froze before turning their faces like rusty robots to look at each other. Mother. Mother? Chapter 757 A Daughter with Three Mothers, by Sherlin. Bai Zemin expected to meet a baby with human features but with ant-like characteristics, and therefore, he expected that at the moment of her birth, his adopted daughter would be crying as if the world was collapsing before her eyes. He could have imagined 1,000 different scenarios, however, one thing he definitely did not expect was that when his daughter was born she would immediately be able to speak. And that her first words would be father and mother. No. The father thing was fine, as Bai Zemin was her father even though they didn't share blood. However, what about the mother thing? Bai Zemin really wanted to throw himself on the floor, wrap himself in a mop, and roll all over the place so that in the process of his wailing he could at least clean up the house a bit. My God! Bai Zemin sucked in a breath of cold air as he looked at Shangguan Bingshui. She was looking at him with wide eyes, clearly as shocked as he was if not more. Could it be that ants were similar to chickens? Did they identify the first creatures they saw as their parents and protective figures? Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui seemed to have become a single entity because as if by prior arrangement they slowly turned their heads to look at the girl whose figure had finally been revealed once. The faint multicolored light surrounding her completely disappeared. Sitting on the couch, a little girl that looked 3 or 4 years old at most stared at them with her bright and innocent midnight black eyes. Her small body was not covered at all, but upon closer inspection one would notice that while her skin was completely white and smooth like that of a baby, what seemed to be black veins adorned her 2 small arms and legs. Her most notable feature, however, was undoubtedly her long, soft, silver-colored hair that cascaded down to just below her small shoulder blades. Bai Zemin took a deep breath, and as he looked at that little doll face, he couldn't help but feel his nerves calm slightly. First, he would try to clarify several things within his means, however, the fact that this little girl was his daughter did not change at all. Bai Zemin slowly approached the couch, his movements closely followed by the little girl who stared at him as if she was worried that he would run off and leave her behind. He stroked her hair gently, much to the little girl's delight. She even obediently closed her eyes and leaned closer to him so that he had better access to her little head. Sherlin, even though I am your father, she is not your mother. Bai Zemin explained quietly. Sherlin? The little girl opened her eyes, and while still enjoying his patting, she used her big eyes to look up at him. She asked curiously, Father, isn't that my first mother's name? Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui looked at each other, both seeing the confusion, as well as the surprise in the other's eyes. After a moment of silence, Bai Zemin resumed the caresses he had subconsciously stopped and said in a gentle voice, The name I chose for you is Bai Sherlin. Bai for our family's surname, and Sherlin is the union of the surname and the name of the former queen of the Weaver Ants. I know that our family surname is Bai. Sherlin also knows that the first mother's name was Sherlin. The little girl nodded, her voice as sweet and pleasant to listen to as the singing of birds on a spring day. Sherlin, how do you know our family name is Bai? That's because Sherlin knows that the father's name is Bai Zemin. Sherlin also knows that the grandfather's name is Bai Dilan while the grandmother's name is Yulinger. How do you know that? That is, of course, because Sherlin's records say so. Bai Zemin sighed in his heart, feeling a little relieved that he doesn't have to explain so many things but at the same time a little sad as he felt he missed several stages of his little girl's growth. Bai Zemin suddenly blinked as he realized something. He looked at Bai Sherlin and said in confusion, Sherlin, you know that I'm actually not an ant, don't you? Sherlin naturally knows. You are human just like the second mother. Bai Sherlin said while looking at Shangguan Bingshui with joyful eyes. Bai Zemin really wanted to ask more about this matter of first mother and second mother, but for now, there was another thing he needed to clarify in order to get deeper into the subject. He lifted Bai Sherlin and sat the girl on his lap, making her squirm with joy. She was as thin as a feather and her body so small and frail-looking that Bai Zemin was afraid of hurting her, therefore, he was very careful with his hand movements. He was very confused at this moment, because although Bai Zemin knew that humans and ants could not have offspring at least in the stages, he could see that Bai Sherlin's eyes were exactly like his own. Even her hair was strangely similar to Shangguan Bingshui's except that instead of being silver-white, it was completely silver. Bingshui, can you help me a little here? Bai Zemin looked at who was the only person that could probably help him. Shangguan Bingshui sighed and sat down beside him. She looked at Bai Shilin with complicated eyes. Shangguan Bingshui naturally noticed certain features on the girl's face that were strangely similar to her own when she was younger. Little Shilin, why are you calling me mother? She asked as she took the small hands of the little girl who despite appearing 3 to 4 years old had actually just been born. Mother, I'm sorry. Shilin doesn't understand your question. Bai Shilin lowered her head in embarrassment and looked really sad for not being able to answer her parents' questions. Oh, don't worry about it. Shangguan Bingshui didn't know why, but she felt the maternal instinct that every woman had inside her begin to awaken. Seeing the sad expression on the girl's face, she hurriedly snatched her from Bai Zemin and hugged her close to her chest while gently kissing the top of her head. Little Shilin, you can call me mother, mama, mommy, mom, or whatever way you like best. Yes, mom. Bai Zemin watched the two beauties, one big and the other little, not knowing whether he should laugh or cry at all of what was going on. How the hell was he supposed to explain this situation to Lilith? Just as Bai Zemin was wondering if he would have to sleep on the couch from today on, Bai Shilin looked at him with curious eyes and tilted her little head as she asked in a sweet voice, by the way, father, where is my third mother? Third mother? Shangguan Bingshui and Bai Zemin looked at each other, now feeling a little less surprised than they would have been if not for everything that had happened during the last few minutes. Bai Zemin looked at his newborn daughter and asked in a low voice, Shilin, can you tell Dad how many mothers you really have? Looks like you've been quite a gallant, Bai Zemin. Shangguan Bingshui raised an eyebrow and said with a faint sneer, to think that you would actually be so popular that your first daughter really has so many mothers. Bai Zemin rolled his eyes at Shangguan Bingshui's words but instead of replying to her he simply waited for his daughter's response. There are 3 of them. Bai Shilin stretched out 3 little fingers forward and looked at her father with sparkling eyes. She looked like a puppy waiting to be rewarded after doing a good job. Bai Zemin gently stroked the left side of her face as he asked softly, so, would you mind telling me who your mothers are and the reason why they are your mothers? Shirleen's first mother is the one who previously led the Weaver Ants. It was she who gave me most of my current records and who gave me life. My second mother is Xianyuan Bingshui, who shared large amounts of her mana with me and in the process shared part of her records. Bai Shilin said as she put a finger to her mouth and began to suck on it like a pacifier. Shangguan Bingshui looked at Bai Zemin and a glint of understanding flashed in the eyes of both of them as they looked at each other. Now they finally understood what was going on here. Bai Zemin said nothing for several seconds, and as he took her finger out of her daughter's mouth and told her that that was not good, he asked, so, who is your third mother? That is, of course, the father's wife. Father's wife? Shangguan Bingshui narrowed her eyes and before Bai Zemin could say anything she continued to stroke the soft hair of the daughter she had inadvertently gained as she asked in a soft voice, Shilin, who is father's wife? Mother Lilith. Bai Shilin answered immediately, there was not the slightest doubt in her voice, and this also made Shangguan Bingshui let out a complicated sigh. She believed that she had at least gotten a little ahead of that woman, but it didn't seem to be that easy. Besides, she said Lilith, not Lily. Shilin, how do you know Lilith? Bai Zemin asked in confusion. Father. Bai Shirleen's eyes sparkled, she replied in a very low voice as if it was some sort of secret that needed to be taken care of from outsiders. Actually, Mother Lilith often hugged me when I was still in the egg. She spent many hours talking to me about all sorts of things while you and the others slept or fought goblins. Even though Lilith Mommy has no records in common with Shilin, Shilin really loves her very much because she told me a lot of funny stories and she is the second most time I have spent with after father. Bai Zemin closed his eyes and sighed in relief when he heard his daughter's words. He was very nervous before, after all, Bai Shilin calling Shangguan Bingshui mother was something that shouldn't have happened. In Bai Zemin's mind, he planned to introduce the newborn to Lilith and gradually teach her that she was her mother, but not everything always went as one wanted or had planned. The matter of mana was something Bai Zemin did not expect, and far from being a baby, Bai Shilin was very intelligent and wise despite her 3-year-old appearance. This was the first time he was dealing with a life born after the apocalypse, a mutant life that was not fully human, so it was to be expected that unexpected things would happen. Fortunately, Lilith was also one of Bai Shirleen's mothers, and the fact that the former queen of the Weaver Ants was also one would serve as a kind of spring that would cushion the fall when she learned that Shangguan Bingshui had also become the mother of the newborn little girl. After a moment of silence, Bai Zemin smiled now clearly relieved and said happily, my dear Shilin, welcome to the family. Yes, Daddy. Bai Zemin froze and the smile on his face was plastered there as the corner of his lips contracted fiercely. Fortunately, Shangguan Bingshui was looking at him in confusion, not knowing what was going on, or else Bai Zemin feared he would have already been frozen to death right there and then. Had Bai Shilin heard Lilith's voice that night? Or maybe he was overthinking things. Whatever the case, Bai Zemin did not dare to ask the reason why Bai Shilin suddenly changed the way she addressed him. Because he somehow feared that the answer would cause Shangguan Bingshui to slap him to death. Determined to change the subject quickly, Bai Zemin's eyes sparkled as he realized something important. "My dear Shilin, could you tell me your current level?" he asked, because even with the purity of his soul power, he was unable to make any estimation of Bai Shilin's level. Bai Zemin's level was only 50, but except for those beings whose soul power was tremendously pure or exceeded him by around 100 levels, he was always able to sense an approximation of the level of his enemies and allies. For example, he could not sense Shangguan Bingshui's level not only because she had a level far higher than his but because her soul power was very pure as well. Then, was Bai Shilin's level tremendously high, or was her soul power too pure? Chapter 758 Heading South, Beginning of the Conquest. Part 1. Bai Shilin blinked as she looked at her father for a few seconds, then she wiggled a little on her second mother's lap to raise her head and look into her eyes for several seconds. Shangguan Bingshui and Bai Zemin exchanged glances, feeling puzzled by Bai Shilin's weird silence before she softly asked, "Little Shilin, is something wrong?" "This." "Bingshui mom, dad." Bai Shilin looked really confused and did not know how to express what was on her mind. Suddenly, her eyes lit up and she quickly spoke so that she wouldn't forget the words that had occurred to her. "Shilin is level 55, but Shilin can tell that mom is at level 90 while dad is at level 50. But then why can't mom and dad sense Shilin's level? Level 55? Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui looked at each other in shock, therefore, they could not immediately answer the question that Bai Shilin had asked them. They were not shocked because the level was too high, on the contrary, they were shocked because it was low considering the huge amount of mana and records that Bai Shilin had absorbed before her birth. However, the main source of shock for the two was something else. Despite being at level 55, Bai Shilin could sense Shangguan Bingshui's level without a problem, while at level 90 Shangguan Bingshui could not sense Bai Shilin's. Didn't this mean that Bai Shilin's soul power, her soul records, were much purer and of higher quality than Shangguan Bingshui's? Although it was hard to believe considering that Shangguan Bingshui had the purest soul power Bai Zemin had ever seen in a living being other than himself, this was the only reason they could both think of. No, wait a moment. Bai Zemin's eyes flashed at the thought of a certain possibility. "Shilin, do you have any skills?" Bai Zemin asked as he played with his daughter's small fingers. "Oh, Shilin naturally has skills." She nodded with enthusiasm and asked quickly, "Does the father and mother would like Shilin to activate one of her skills?" "This." Bai Zemin gave Shangguan Bingshui a sidelong glance before shaking his head. "Shilin, don't do it. Better just tell us the function of each of your skills." Bai Zemin didn't want to take any risks. If his beloved daughter brimming with innocence ended up activating a strange destructive type skill, the destruction of Shangguan Bingshui's entire household would no longer be the real problem, but probably many innocents could be affected. Besides, judging from the way Bai Shilin was talking, she even had more than one skill from birth, as expected from the highest and never-before-seen genius in the entire history of the ant race. With Shilin's records, part of Bai Zemin's records, and part of Shangguan Bingshui's records, Bai Shilin was undoubtedly a little monster that in the future would be a source of terror to her enemies despite her sweet and cute appearance. Bai Shilin took a few minutes to check her own records. She was new to all this, so while opening and closing her status window was easy, surfing through the records that made up her total existence to find a few specific ones was no simple task at all. A single ruin could have over 10,000 records composing it. One could only try to imagine how huge a number of records a living, intelligent entity must have. After about 10 minutes, during which both Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui remained silent while looking at Bai Shilin's serious little face, she finally opened her previously closed little eyes and said with enthusiasm, "Okay. I found them." She quickly continued, "Shilin has a skill to see the future. This skill is weaker than the skill Shilin mother had when she was still alive, and I can only see up to 10 seconds forward but with a 2-minute cooldown. I also have a skill called Ice Maker, but it is already in the 3rd order. This skill Shilin has thanks to the records of Bingshui mom. Also, Dad, Mom, Shilin finally knows why she can know your levels. It's because Shilin has a passive skill that allows her to sense the levels of any living being within the same order or below. Lastly, Shilin has a skill called Overlap Strength." "Overlap Strength? Ice Maker?" Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui gasped in shock. The most surprised, however, was undoubtedly Bai Zemin. Overlap regeneration was the second activation of a skill, not a skill per SE. However, his newborn daughter had acquired a skill with a suspiciously similar name. What was this all about? Xietain really didn't understand anything. Charlene's entire birth seemed like a miracle in itself. She could even see the future up to 10 seconds ahead with 2 minutes of cooldown. Such a thing was simply insane. With 10 seconds ahead, Charlene would even be able to read all of Xietan's future moves and take him out of the game in seconds easily if she played her cards right and Xietain got careless. But, Dad, Mom, this skill of mine, overlap strength, isn't as good as the overlap regeneration Dad has. Charlene looked a little embarrassed as she lowered her head and whispered softly. When Charlene was trying to eat the records Dad transmitted during the last few minutes after activating that powerful skill, many green messages started to fill my eyes, and in the end this skill overlap strength was the only thing I could have because my soul wasn't too powerful to have overlap regeneration. After hearing Charlene's words, Shangguan Bingshui couldn't help but look at Xietain out of the corner of her eye. Her eyes glinted strangely, her thoughts unknown. As for Xietain, he remained silent for a moment, trying to digest his daughter's words. After a few seconds, he looked into her eyes and asked curiously, Charlene, what is the benefit overlap strength grants you? Charlene tilted her little head and looked at him blankly. It seems that despite her intelligence at most it's only that of a 5-year-old. Xietain judged silently after realizing that the overly complicated words seemed to be somewhat difficult for his daughter to understand. When you activate your skill overlap strength, what happens? Xietain rephrased with a gentle smile. Oh. Charlene clapped her little hands and swung her little feet as she replied with enthusiasm, when Charlene activates her overlap strength skill, Charlene can take 50% of a stat except for health and convert it into strength points for 1 minute. It was a powerful skill, there was no room for doubt about it. This was especially the case considering that Charlene was at least 50% of the Weaver ant race, so her strength was definitely not something to scoff at. It was just that Xietain wasn't too surprised because his overlap regeneration was much more flexible. Of course, he was still surprised and couldn't help but praise Charlene several times, telling her that in the future she would be a great ally to everyone. The little girl was so happy that she began to laugh and giggle with joy before throwing herself into her father's arms, much to Shangguan Bingshui's frustration. Approximately 40 minutes later, Xietain said goodbye to Shangguan Bingshui and left her house to head to his family's home. Although the Ice Princess was a little reluctant to part with little Charlene, she understood that Xietain wanted to introduce her to his parents, so she very reluctantly nodded. Although Charlene was a high-level soul evolver and her mutant ant blood helped her fight the night cold much better than normal humans, neither Xietain nor Shangguan Bingshui was willing to let the girl go out naked in the fierce winds blowing from all directions. As a result, little Charlene ended up looking like some kind of strange creature after being wrapped in several woolen blankets that Shangguan Bingshui used to cover her. Father, is this our house? Charlene asked, snuggling into the embrace of her beloved father who carried her like a porcelain doll wrapped in the woolen blankets. We will have many houses in the future, Charlene. Xietain smiled slightly, and as he walked to the entrance, he added, but we will have only one home. Xietain opened the door and both he and his little adopted daughter were greeted by the warmth and lights inside, as well as the voices and giggles coming from the living room. That home will be where our family is. Charlene's eyes sparkled as she heard her beloved father's words. Even though she didn't understand very well what he meant, somehow she felt her heart warming up when she heard those last words, so she couldn't help but close her little eyes and rub her little head on his chest as if trying to get even closer. Mengqi was sitting on the couch and was waiting for her turn to play the snake game. It seemed that she had also joined the small gamer team of Luo Ning and the Wen twins. She had arrived about 2 hours ago after her brother disappeared from the workshop and had been waiting for him, but so far there was no sign of him. Just then, Mengqi noticed out of the corner of her eye a figure entering the living room and immediately jumped to her feet. Ah, big brother. You, where? Mengqi's words caught in her throat as her eyes subconsciously moved from Xietan's face to the ball of wool he was holding in his hands at chest level. That was definitely not a normal ball of wool, it was moving and there was silver hair bulging out. Baidilan and Yilinger were chatting with Lilith in her lily form, especially with Baidilan and Lily being the two most talkative since it was about the journey of conquest that Xietain was about to embark on. The three of them had been talking about it for quite a few hours, and although Yilinger and Baidilan had tried to convince her, Lilith tactfully turned them down, saying that her place was wherever Xietain was. The fact that she said such words naturally earned several sighs from Baidilan and an even stronger look of approval from Yilinger. Only a woman who had the will to accompany Baizemen in dangerous times and to suffer hardships in the outside world would be accepted by both of them. Neither of them would look favorably on a woman who sought only to stay at home doing nothing, eating and enjoying luxuries ostentatiously. Just then, Mengqi's voice calling out to Baizemen attracted the attention of Baidilan and Yilinger. But when the two of them turned to look towards the entrance of the living room and saw what Baizemen was carrying in his arms, they froze completely. This was because, in contrast to Mengqi, Baidilan and Yilinger could see a beautiful, small doll-like face looking towards them with two large, shining, midnight black eyes. Bai Shilin squirmed a little in Baizemen's embrace, and taking this as a sign from her asking him to put her down for a moment, he obediently put her down. Baizemen didn't even have time to arrange the blankets or tell his daughter to be careful about tripping when she unwrapped herself and ran out to one of the couches located further east in the spacious living room. "Lilith, mommy!" Lilith was already on her feet and immediately went down on her knees as she waited for the little girl who ran towards her with her arms wide open, bright eyes full of joy, and a smile as big as a child's receiving the best gift of all. Bai Shilin practically bumped into Lilith as she stepped into her embrace and immediately giggled happily as she felt the soft, warm arms wrap around her. "Shilin, now we can finally talk properly." Lilith smiled lovingly and put a delicate kiss on the girl's silver hair, something that caught her attention slightly. Bai Shilin raised her head as even with Lilith on her knees she was still smaller. Her eyes sparkled as she said with a happy smile, "Lilith, mommy, this hug feels even warmer than when I was in the egg." "Silly girl, that's because now we can both feel each other's body heat." Lilith smiled tenderly and explained. He. Baizemen watched the scene with a gentle smile on his face. His subordinates, especially those who had stood beside him on at least one battlefield, would definitely not be able to believe that the cold and bloodthirsty Baizemen who did not hesitate to blow up the bodies of his enemies into bloody mist would actually have such a gentle expression in his ever-indifferent eyes. He was not worried about the fact that Bai Shilin had called Lilith by her real name. After all, it was a matter that could easily be solved by saying that Lily was an abbreviation since everyone had called her that since she was a child. But in fact, there was no need to worry about it at all since regardless of whether it was Baidilan, Yilinger, Mengqi, Luoning, or the Wen twins, they all looked at the little girl who looked to be around 3 years old. Although each of them had their own thoughts and emotions, the shock was the same for all of them. Bai Shilin's eyes moved to Yilinger, and when Baizemen's mother saw those two beautiful black eyes, she didn't need anyone to tell her anything to know that this little girl was somehow or other related to her and her family. "Grandmother, grandfather, Aunt Mengqi. My name is Bai Shilin, and I am my father's daughter," said Bai Shilin with happiness to be reunited with her loved ones and pride in announcing her identity as Baizemen's daughter. Chapter 759 Heading South, Beginning of the Conquest. Part 2, Xietain. Yilinger called out to her son, her eyes still fixed on the eyes of the little girl who had just called her grandmother. "This young lady." Baizemen looked at his mother, and noticing her lips, as well as her trembling eyes, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Yilinger, just like Baidilan, had always been worried about Baizemen's future. Not about his studies nor about getting a job since she knew that her son was a person who would definitely not give up in the face of life's difficulties. Yilinger's worries lay in the fact that her son never looked at any girl again for many years after what happened during his high school years. Would he be able to start a family? Would he find a good wife to be his confidant and partner in times of trouble? Would she ever see a grandchild? Would he be alone forever? There were many questions about family that Yilinger always asked in her heart every time she saw her son. After all, the parents would not be there forever, and Yilinger did not want her son to be alone by the time they were no longer there for him. Baizemen naturally understood and was aware of his parents' anxieties, but there was not much he could do about the matter. After all, the heart was a realm where the brain had no right to step in. It was ironic. It was very ironic that thanks to the appearance of the soul record, things began to change for the better from a certain point of view. "Mom, this is Bai Shilin, my daughter." Baizemen nodded, confirming the little girl's words. Yilinger's body trembled and her mouth opened and closed as if she wanted to say something but could not put it into words. Baizemen had already explained to them the situation regarding the metal gray egg, therefore, everyone in the house knew that someday he would appear with a little girl in his arms. However, the little girl they were looking at had Baizemen's eyes, and except for the black lines covering part of her little arms and slender legs, there was nothing to differentiate her from a normal human. At a loss for words to express how she felt at that moment, Yilinger leaned forward and called out in a soft, careful voice, as if afraid of scaring the little girl, "Little Shilin, can you let Grandma hug you?" Bai Shilin smiled sweetly and rushed out to Yilinger, burying herself in her embrace and catching her a little by surprise. Yilinger's arms moved of their own accord, wrapping around Bai Shirleen's small body and hugging her as if she feared she was going to disappear in the next instant. Grandma, Shirlene really hoped to see you all really. Yilinger lowered her eyes, meeting the shining black eyes of the unexpected but welcome granddaughter her son had just given her. Child, if you keep saying such things you'll make this old woman start crying. Yilinger forced a smile and kissed Bai Shirleen's forehead, causing her to giggle. Bai Dilan watched everything in silence, but his stare was fixed on Bai Shirleen's small figure. There were several times when he had to close his eyes for a few seconds because he felt his eyes start to itch. Bai Zemin sneaked up and whispered, "Hey, old man. You can cry if you want to. The man of the house is me anyway. I'll really kick your ass, you rotten shameless brat." After several minutes, everyone was sitting on the two large couches. Yilinger was still clinging to Bai Shirleen and occasionally hugged her so tightly that the girl started squirming in her lap, pouting and muttering under her breath. "So, we could say that little Shirleen is your real daughter and not adopted?" Bai Dilan asked, trying to act calm as he looked down at the little treasure who occasionally looked up at him and waved her little hand in his direction, pulling at his old heartstrings. "Well, in theory, that's the way things are." Bai Zemin nodded. "Even though Shirleen wasn't born by the methods we know for obvious reasons, she shares some of my records and that's why she has little traits, especially her eyes, that look so much like mine." "I see." Bai Dilan nodded and said nothing more. Although he maintained a calm expression on the surface, everyone who knew him well was aware that his heart was definitely not so calm. Mengqi was also very happy as she looked at Bai Shirleen. She would occasionally lean forward and grab the girl's nose, using her thumb to pretend to steal it, which ended up causing Bai Shirleen to jump in fright several times to everyone's amusement. "Whoa! Big brother Bai, now you're a father too!" Luoning exclaimed with wide eyes as she looked at Bai Shirleen in surprise. Wen Yun suddenly thought of something and approached Luoning, whispering something in her ear in such a low voice that only Lilith knew what she said and couldn't help but laugh at this little girl's mischief. "Ah!" Luoning cried out in fright and her face turned pale, astonishing everyone. "Little Ning, what's wrong?" Bai Zemin looked at her in a daze. "Be big brother Bai. You have a daughter now. Doesn't that mean that little Ning can no longer be the princess of the new kingdom?" Luoning whispered. She looked at Bai Zemin with puppy dog eyes full of tears that threatened to fall if he said anything she didn't like. "Wen Yun, you?" Bai Zemin looked at the girl who simply stuck her tongue out at him and really had to fight the urge to slap her, but until she learned how to behave. "Little Ning, don't worry. It doesn't matter if I have one daughter or 1,000 daughters, since I promised you that when I am the king of China you will be a princess, then you will be a princess. Have I ever lied to you?" Bai Zemin said in a sincere voice. Luoning looked at him, trying to look for some trace of falsehood in his words. However, it was true that he had never lied to her. Therefore, she finally shook her head and her tears receded so quickly that Bai Zemin even thought she deliberately did it. Lying on the bed in Bai Zemin's room, Lilith and he were cuddled together under the blankets. Even though she didn't need to sleep, she was slowly getting used to enjoying these little things that she had forgotten over time. "Your parents really love little Shirleen, they even asked that we let her sleep with them tonight," Lilith whispered softly, sounding especially appealing in the middle of the night darkness. Bai Zemin caressed her shoulder gently, pulling her closer to his body, and said softly, "My parents always wanted a grandchild, now that they have one they will naturally become attached to her. Besides, considering that in 2 days we will be leaving for the south, they won't see little Shirleen again for a few months, so they will want to spend as much time with her as possible." Bai Zemin planned to begin the conquest of the entire country without delay. He would probably not see his parents again for at least half a year, starting directly with the most difficult target and expanding from there. Fortunately, with the Sky Destroyer being left behind, he could always use the ship's communication feature to talk to them on a daily basis using the ring of the commander. Lilith was silent for a few minutes, but when she sensed that Bai Zemin was about to fall asleep, she whispered quietly, "Say, Zemin. Shirleen's silver hair." Bai Zemin slowly opened his eyes as he heard the words of the woman beside him. Even without Lilith finishing, he already knew what she meant. Shirleen's silver hair is a result of Bing Shui's records," he said in an honest voice before he started explaining everything that happened without omitting anything at all. Lilith listened to everything silently as she snuggled into his embrace and enjoyed without a word the gentle caresses he gave her small shoulder and right arm. "I see. So that's what happened. I understand now." She nodded calmly once he stopped. Bai Zemin gently moved to look her in the face and asked carefully, "Are you crazy?" "No, not at all. In the entire base probably only Shangguan Bing Shui and that girl named Feng Tianwu possess enough mana to help you get little Shirleen born smoothly, and unfortunately, I couldn't do anything even if I wanted to. The fact that little Sherlyn considers me her mother despite not sharing records with me is a sign of my victory. It shows that she appreciates me more than her other two mothers. Lilith smiled sweetly and gave him a small kiss on the cheek. She blushed a little and whispered softly, besides, in the future we will have our own children, won't we? Xietain sighed in relief in his heart, finally feeling the stone weighing on him disappear after hearing Lilith's words. He gently kissed her forehead and said in a serious voice, of course we will. After I reach my goal and there is no longer a threat to us, we will have our children using normal methods. Xietain knew nothing of Lilith's past, it was a complete mystery to him. She never initiated a conversation of her lived experiences, and Xietain never asked questions either. However, this did not mean that he was unaware that she definitely saw and experienced things that would probably be more than enough to make most living beings collapse. Furthermore, considering that she never mentioned her family, Xietain naturally judged that she did not have one. That was precisely why he was determined to give her a beautiful family at any cost. That's more than enough for me. Lilith smiled gently and closed her eyes, feeling happy. She had lost everything, and only she knew how much she longed for a family. Knowing that losing everything was painful was not the same as losing everything. Between Lilith and Xietain, the pains he had experienced were nothing in comparison. I look forward to that future, she murmured before falling asleep. The next day, Xietain went to check the records of the chest plate that he and Mengqi had built in teamwork. The armor was deep red as if it had been dipped in a pool of blood for several thousand years, and all the blood had been assimilated by it. Just like the pants, the armor seemed to be covered by dragon scales, and on each of the two elbows was a scythe that in the past were part of the most terrifying armament of the Third Order Weaver, ants that Xietain faced in the hall where he gained control over the Sky Destroyer. Solitude's Armor of Infinite Trials. Upper Armor. Rank, 2. Physical Defense, 4,700. Magic Defense, 3,420. Physical Attack Power, 2,100. Durability, 8,000/8,000. Special Options. 1. Reduces its weight by half when the wearer's agility exceeds 900 natural points. 2. When hitting with the elbow, the chance of inflicting critical hit is increased by 20%. 3. Reduces the damaging effect of shock waves by 30%. 4. When fighting in a battlefield alone, the physical and magic defense is multiplied by 2. Description: upper body armor forged from the bones and scales of a second-order Komodo lizard and reinforced with rank 2 mithril. Both the blacksmith and the rune engraver gave 100% of themselves to forge this piece of equipment, which is at the top of its kind within the same rank. The nightmare of warriors and the despair of mages on the battlefield. The armor was magnificent, to say the least. When Xietain saw its records for the first time after it was completely finished, he was jumping for several minutes at how high the armor's defenses were, but what gave him the most joy were the options. Despite being a heavy piece of equipment, option number 1 helped Xietain not feel reluctant to wear it at all. In addition, options number 3 and number 4 would greatly increase Xietan's chances of survival while giving him more opportunities to make more dangerous attacks and thus be able to take the victory in difficult battles. That same day, after putting on all their equipment, since the current Earth was definitely several times more dangerous than before, Xietain and Shenmei left for the north in the morning, and when Xietain returned in the dusk, Shenmei was gone, but her place had been replaced by Conlan. He had left Fu Xiafeng in charge of the base in the north, and to cushion the loss of such a powerful mage and healer as Conlan was, he brought Shenmei to take her place. Conlan was crucial to Xietain, even with Xia at his side. Conlan's position had not wavered at all. Although Conlan was a little confused after seeing Lily at the base, she did not ask too many questions and obeyed Xietan's arrangements. Because there was no point in making it too complicated, considering that the next morning they would be moving out, she stayed at Kai Jingyi's house. Even if Conlan wanted to walk around the base to see the faction's new establishment, she was tired, as she and Xietain had faced several enemies while running at high speeds for practically the whole evening, so when her exhausted body hit the bed she immediately fell asleep. The next day, as had been prepared for a week earlier, a team of 400 soul evolvers had gathered outside the south gate. This small team was destined to make history by being the main vanguard that initiated the assault on the various human establishments, conquering them one by one and expanding unstoppably in all directions. The conquest of the country had finally begun. Chapter 760, Goodbye 1 week. The winds were still cold, and just as Xietain had predicted a week ago, it looked like the earth would be undergoing major changes soon. Even though it was not yet winter, and even though snow was not a normal occurrence in this part of the country, the previous night had been a great indication that it might soon begin to snow. Although it was just after 6 a.m. and the sun was in the sky, a thin layer of frost covered the land as far as the eye could see. However, despite the extremely low temperatures, there were several survivors who had gathered near the south gate, so the soldiers armed to the teeth had to be extra careful to avoid any kind of inconvenience. As for the reason why these survivors had gathered there, I heard that the new leader will be taking a troop of several hundred soul evolvers to the south. I also heard that rumor. It seems that the new leader is aiming to conquer new territories and help our compatriots to get out of misery. The current situation is already so bad, wouldn't it be better if everyone stayed here? The base has been receiving attacks from zombies and mutant beasts on a daily basis for the entire last week. What if because of the new leader taking the most powerful troops this settlement ends up falling? I knew the change of leader wouldn't be a good idea. Shut up. What do you know? The new leader has already conquered the north of Beijing and saved thousands of compatriots there. Do you expect someone powerful to stand by while many brothers and sisters suffer? I didn't say that. There were many voices, so it was difficult to know who said what. However, it was true that the movement this time was no longer a secret to anyone on the base. Outside the walls, most of the soul evolvers carefully selected to accompany the leader in this conquest operation were spending as much time as they could with their loved ones, because they knew that at the very least, it would be several months before they could see them again, and in the worst-case scenario, they might never see them again. In the part closest to the gate, Xietain was also saying goodbye to some people. Xietain, do you really have to go? Xietain asked. She had to bite her lip several times to stop the tears she was holding back from falling. Xietain sighed. He forced a smile, and as he caressed his mother's face, he said in a soft voice, "Mother, I have to. I need to start somewhere to get somewhere. Wasn't that what you have always taught me?" But Xietain bit her lip hard, and the reluctance in her eyes was getting stronger and stronger. She knew her son had great goals, and considering his strength he had what it took to complete them. However, despite knowing that he would soon be departing far away, only now did Xietain realize that she was unwilling to part from him. They had only met a month ago at most, but only spent half of that month together. Now, not only was Xietain leaving, but Mengqi was leaving with him as well. Knowing that she would not see either of her two children for who knew how long, Xietain felt as if a pair of cruel hands were squeezing her heart tightly, trying to break it into pieces. "Linger, that's enough." Baidilan's voice sounded from the side, surprising Mengqi and Xietain a little, since he was usually the one reprimanded and very rarely spoke in that angry tone of voice to Xietain. Only Xietain understood Baidilan better, and knew the kind of man his father was, so he was not surprised like them. Baidilan looked at his wife and said in a deep voice, "Our kids are talented and strong, they possess the ability to build a truly safe place for all of us, but for that to happen they need to work hard. We don't need to add more burdens to them than they already carry, don't you think?" Xietain was surprised to hear her husband's words. However, she soon understood, and realizing what she was doing, lowered her head in embarrassment. "I'm sorry." Mengqi bit her lip on the verge of tears and quickly moved forward to hug her mother while whispering that there was no need to be sorry for anything and that she loved her very much. "Old man, if you make Mom cry I'll beat you up." Xietain raised an eyebrow at his father as he said those words. "Brat, if one of these three ladies suffers some kind of injustice along the way you'd better bury yourself underground and don't let me find you." Baidilan snorted in response. "Hee, it's okay grandpa, my father will protect us all." Bai Shirlin said with a happy smile. She was currently being carried by Baidilan and was wearing a beautiful white dress, white woolen stockings, white shoes, a large white feather coat, white woolen gloves, and a woolen cap with a pompon, also white. She looked like a little angel. Baidilan kissed the girl's forehead, and as he handed her to Lilith in her lily form, he said with a gentle smile, "Shirlin, Grandpa will miss you." "Shirlin will miss Grandpa too." She smiled sweetly and her eyes curved into a crescent shape, making the hearts of everyone nearby become warm. Approximately 5 minutes later, Tinghua approached the family group and after greeting everyone with a friendly smile he turned to Xietain. "Leader Bai, we are all ready. We can leave at any moment." Xietain nodded and looked behind him. Leaving aside his men's familiars, about 50 meters away were exactly 400 soul evolvers, among which there were 9 second-order existences and the rest were all first-order powerhouses that had formed up, orderly, and were waiting for his orders to depart along with 10 majestic-looking beasts. These 10 beasts were actually 10 of the roaring flame tigers that Xietan's group had encountered in the Sky Destroyer, but unlike their small and adorable sizes of the past, they now looked much more dominant and powerful. Each of them had been carefully nurtured by second-order existences, and under the constant hunting of powerful enemies, as well as the absorption of extremely pure soul power, these 10 roaring flame tigers finally became mounts of at least level 27. Except for one of the mounts, the other 9 were occupied by the 9 second-order existences that would be forming the 9 pillars that would accompany Xietain on this long and dangerous journey he was about to embark on. Shangguanbing Shui, Tinghua and his tamed snake, Xingyun with his great mass control skills, Kai Jingyi, Zhongde, Nangongling Qinhe, Feng Tianwu, and finally Wu Yijuan, who had broken the second order 3 days ago after obtaining an item called Forest Heart that belonged to a level 70 mutant tree which she managed to kill on her own with great difficulty. Each and every one of these soul evolvers wore armor with at least 500 defense points and possessed weapons with at least 600 physical attack points. In addition, most of them possessed an electromagnetic rifle on their back that would be used to keep their enemies at a distance in case of need. As for food, that would not be a problem from now on, only the weak would starve. The strong could hunt in any forest. It was time to leave. Xietain took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He did not want to look weak before his family or subordinates, so he could not afford to shed tears in this place. Father, mother, remember that if anything happens you must head to Sky Destroyer immediately. Xietain turned to look at his parents and said in a deep voice, within a maximum of 6 months we should be able to meet again unless things get a little complicated. Until then, be safe please. He didn't wait for his parents to say anything. Xietain was afraid he wouldn't be able to leave if he waited too long. Little Snow, Mengqi, Lily, let's go. Xietain advanced with firm steps, being closely followed by a giant snow-white dog, and 2 women, one of whom was carrying a beautiful little girl whose silver hair was partially contained by the cute woolen cap on her head. Yilinger subconsciously took a step forward with the intention of following them, but Baidilan grabbed her by the arm and shook his head silently. She, seeing the tears running down her husband's stoic face, finally understood that she was not the only one having a hard time, therefore, she silently sank into his embrace and began to sob softly. Mengqi jumped on Little Snow's back, who at this point looked more like a white wolf than a dog, and soon after Kan Lan joined her. On the other hand, Lilith in her human form and Bai Shilin were helped by Xietain to climb on the back of the last roaring flame tiger. There were several eyes that focused on Lily and the little girl in their embrace, but no one said anything. Everyone now knew that this woman was actually the leader's woman while the little girl was the daughter the 2 of them had adopted. Only Qinhe and Wu Yijuan looked at Bai Shilin with eyes full of complex emotions since unlike the others they knew the truth about her birth. Xietain ignored the stares of his subordinates and advanced to the front of the lineup of troops. Fully equipped, his cloak flapped lightly even though the winds were frighteningly powerful, and strangely enough, the temperature around him was warm and pleasant, causing the frost under his feet to melt with every step he took. Reaching 20 meters away from everyone, he turned and shouted aloud, "What are our targets? Conquer! Save our compatriots! Slaughter the zombies! Reclaim our lost lands! Search for our families!" Hundreds shouted aloud. The roars of approximately 400 or so soul evolvers whose average level was 35 was no joke at all. The ground shook and the survivors behind the giant walls felt their hearing go numb, finally making them fall silent to the relief of the soldiers. Xietain nodded and did not say much more. Once the place was quiet again, he slammed his cloak back, causing it to flap loudly, and turned to face the distant plain that would lead them into the unknown. Move! Bang! With a mighty stomp, the ground beneath Xietan's left foot cracked and then exploded as his body shot forward. Bang! 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 With the leader advancing and leading the path personally, the 391 soul evolvers on foot did not lag behind, and with powerful stomps turned into flickering shadows that in seconds crossed hundreds of meters. The roaring flame tigers and Little Snow were naturally more striking, turning into 10 black shadows with glowing fire and a single impurity-free white shadow that quickly overtook the others. Although the most powerful ones controlled the speed at which they ran so as not to consume too much stamina and separate themselves from the others, the speed at which they were moving was definitely over 100 kilometers per hour. Therefore, the families who had gone to say goodbye to their loved ones soon found themselves filled with sadness as they watched the small dark dots getting smaller and smaller in the distance. As the minutes passed, some began to leave, and by the time 30 minutes had passed most had returned home. However, even after an hour, there were 3 people who were still staring into the distance even though there was nothing there. Wu Keqian sighed. Looking to his left, he saw Xietan's parents still staring into the distance, just as he had been doing a moment ago. He approached them, catching Baidilan's attention, but Yilinger's eyes, now red from crying, were still focused on the horizon as if waiting for the return of those who had just left. "Brother Bai, we should return." Wu Keqian sighed again and shook his head. "You shouldn't let your wife stay out so long in this weather." Baidilan nodded and whispered something to Yilinger, slowly bringing her out of the dazed state she had fallen into after her children's departure. Lord Wu. Yilinger nodded, her voice raspy and weak. Forget the word Lord. Just call me by my name, in the future we might be family after all. Wu Keqian tried to lighten the mood, but unfortunately he failed. He sighed as he saw the miserable appearance of not only Yilinger but also Baidilan, and while patting the latter's shoulder, he said in a complex voice, at least you two have each other. I was not only left by my daughter but even my wife decided to join this journey of conquest. Brother Keqian has his second wife, at least you won't feel lonely. Baidilan tried to make him feel better. However, Wu Keqian smiled bitterly and shook his head without saying anything else. He now somewhat understood the reason why Baidilan was unwilling to casually take just any woman and preferred to focus on just one. He had taken a beautiful woman as his second wife. However, it was today that Wu Keqian finally realized that feelings are forged over time or with shared experiences. It was not something that was born just like that. While he was feeling sad looking off into the distance, his second wife returned to the house after only 15 minutes saying it was too cold for her to be outside. Not that this was a bad thing, but Wu Keqian finally began to understand Baizemin a little. What was the use of having thousands if none of those thousands were there when you really needed them? So far, except for that time when he was almost lost in the infinite space after the collapse of the cosmic gate, Wu Yijuan had not been able to prove to Baizemin that she was really willing to do anything for him. Therefore, Baizemin paid no attention to her feelings. Wu Keqian made a mistake, because instead of focusing more on feelings, he focused more on beauty. That was why his heart now felt as cold as the cold winds that cut his face. The three of them returned to base, to their respective homes, feeling sad for the same, similar, but at the same time different reasons. And just like that, a week passed in an instant. During this week, Baizemin's group faced many dangers, and with this being the first time such a large operation had been carried out since the second evolution of Earth, this was the first time they realized that they needed to be careful in every step they took if they did not want to be wiped out even before they arrived to their first destination.